It's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID live stream, Series 9, Episode 5. Ooh, it's the Herbie episode, number 053, starts here. And what an exciting week it's been in markets. And actually, let me start on a personal note and devote this whole segment to something relating to me. Valerium. I mentioned a few weeks ago that it was now Valerium PLC, having dropped the blockchain from its name. But we are indeed still a tech-dominated company, as you could read in Wired magazine just last week. And of course, then was our wonderful news on Friday and Monday. We've got the money. And better still, ladies and gentlemen, we've got the deal. We're buying 90% of the Gibraltar Stock Exchange. That is, of course, regulators willing. It's all got to go to permission from the GFSC in due course, but allowing for that to take place is an exciting moment for us all because we're going to be the owners of the Gibraltar Stock Exchange through Valerium PLC. All this and more, much more, has been already covered in the Bourse Business Digest in greater detail. Exchange Invest, the daily water cooler of the exchange business. If you'd like to try a free trial, send us an email or hit me up on whatever social media you're watching this stream today. Welcome to everybody who is there in the audience from Facebook, from YouTube, and indeed, of course, LinkedIn. Send us a little bit of love, please. Give us a compliment in the appropriate button. And in fact, drop us a comment, ask us a question, because this evening, ladies and gentlemen, we have got two fantastic guests, two diverse tech Musketeers, Julia Streets and Eliza Filby. Julia Streets is the incomparable founder and CEO of Streets Consulting. She was formerly Global Head of MarComms at New York Stock Exchange. That was NYSE Technologies. And previous to that, Instinet Europe. Julia is also a host of DiverCity Podcast. She, apart from that series, is a mentor, an MC, a speaker, and I have to say, a jolly good stand-up comic, making her the second stand-up comedian we've had on this show, of course, after Dominic Frisby, who was waxing lyrical about Bitcoin about 40 shows ago. Dr. Eliza Filby is a writer, speaker, and consultant specializing in generational intelligence. She helps companies and services understand generational shifts within politics, society, and the workplace. Her work has ranged from, well, an eclectic range of different clients, all the way from Vice Media to the royal household. Presumably not difficult to tell the difference between those two gigs. Eliza is the author of Fueling Gender Diversity, Unlocking the Next Generation Workplace, and Mind the Gap, Managing a Multi-Generational Workforce in the Post-Pandemic Age. And she recently launched her own podcast, It's All Relative. Well, ladies, greetings. Gosh, where do we start from there? Something about a post-pandemic world. Gosh, well, they kept that very quiet, the idea there was a pandemic going on, didn't they? Julia, where in the world are you today?
So I'm in London. I'm in my study in London. And I think when we caught up last week, I was in Zurich, and actually enjoying the fact that we're getting back into travel, which is very good. But yeah, London tonight.
Oh, London tonight. I'm glad that the PCR tests and all of those other forms lined up for you to manage to make it home after Zurich last week. Eliza, where do we find you in the world this evening?
I'm live from South London, having spent the first month of the year pretty much in self-isolation. My entire family was running wild and savage by COVID, and we have just in the last week got a full negative household. So I come to you COVID-free and ready to talk.
Excellent. COVID-free and ready to talk. That's the most important part of all, is the latter bit. Good to hear from you both, ladies. So here we are. We're in this COVID post-pandemic situation. Eliza, tell us a little bit about what's going on as far as you see it.
Well, I think we're hearing a lot these days about the Great Resignation. It's being called the Great Reshuffle. We're having lots of talk around people, workers specifically, having pandemic epiphanies. And I think that's off of the back of the fact that lockdown fundamentally gave us a lot of time to think. Maybe it was a pressured and a stressful time to think. But I think the lockdown process and experience has fundamentally genuinely reordered our relationship with our homes and how we want to spend time within them, where we want to work within them, obviously. It's changed our relationship with time and where work, hobbies, family, health, mental and physical fit within that 24-hour day. It's changed our relationship with our families. I think how we spend time with them, how we're present with them, and how we fit it around our work. And it's changed our relationship with our health, and I think holistic understanding of health, both mental and physical. And ultimately now we're seeing, I think, the real growing pains of a new relationship between work and life. And I think that at the moment, the power rests very much in the hands of the employees. And I'm talking obviously about white collar workers rather than blue collar workers. There's a real divide there, obviously those that are able to remote and those that can't. But I think within the white collar contingent, I think there's a deep conversation that's going to take about 5 years, by the way, to ferment and get clarity on. But I think we're seeing a real shake up in how people work, where people work, what they get paid, and what work they do. And obviously this is in line with changes that were happening already, but were accelerated by the pandemic, and will be accelerated further, by the way, when AI and technology as a whole really seeks to adapt and shape the future of work.
Well, there's a good canvas to manage to occupy the next couple of days. We'll be here until about Wednesday afternoon, probably, at this rate. It's fabulous, Eliza. Thank you very much. That was definitely a macro view par excellence. So, Julia, actually, let's turn this around a bit. I mean, you actually run a team, and you were naturally somewhat distributed in your workplace from the very foundation of Streets, right?
That's right. So this is our 15th year of doing business. And 15 years ago, I set up an entirely virtual business model. We have teams all over the UK and also internationally as well. And I've just always believed that you don't need to be in a physical space to do the job you need to do. And what's much more important is that you focus on the work that needs to get done. And technology is a great enabler. So for us, it's been actually very interesting going through the pandemic. We grew 30%. Because we're just used to working on a distributed basis, and it's proved at the moment we've got a lot of interest, and we're hiring. There's got a lot of interest of people coming in, just going, well, actually, to Eliza's point, I don't think I want to work in a traditional structure anymore. It appeals to have an organization that understands culturally how to work well in a distributed basis. So it's an interesting time for us. But I think the whole point about the Great Resignation is one that we can't ignore. And I think we're right on the point of organizations almost insisting that people come back into the workspaces and managing a hybrid model of 2 days a week out, 3 days a week in, or some variation like that. But also it adds some interesting questions about leadership. And we have a generation of leaders who are used to stepping out of corner offices, looking at all the people within their domain on the floor in a glass and steel building, who are now having to manage and lead in a very different way, which is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's quite interesting, and certainly it's been quite fascinating to see who can manage an outbreak of leadership during the time that we're here. Let me just say, first of all, good evening to the first 3 folks who've put their heads above the parapet with a message this evening. It is a delight to hear from you. Hello, Marcus Ward. Hello, Simon Huckle. And hello, Les Calvert. Great to have you all watching this evening. If you'd like to ask anything, do not hesitate to positive comment or question to whoever you might wish to this evening. So, Eliza, looking at what you're talking about, and obviously it's very interesting because Julia's got this already distributed workforce. How do you see the shift at the moment? And particularly we're thinking, of course, about financial businesses. How do they manage to cope with this sudden demand of lots of people who want to work from home?
I think, well, there's a number of things there. I think anyone that tells you they've got an absolute answer and a concrete resolution to this problem is lying. I think at the moment, the power is very much in the hands of the employees, because they have acquired over the course of lockdown this amazing autonomy. and they are loath to give it away. And I read an interesting stat yesterday that the majority of people see flexible working and the ability to have a control over their timetable as tantamount to a 10% pay rise. That's how much people are now valuing flexible working. And it used to be, of course, something that perhaps, a mother of a preschool child would have an awkward conversation around they can't do sort of a late Tuesday or Thursday because they have to do school drop-off. Pandemic completely turned those awkward conversations on the head, because now people are expecting flexibility. And actually organizations and companies like Julia's, of course, have almost kind of ahead of the game, because they have those systems in place, that management culture already there. They know they're comfortable in that. So people that are expecting flexibility are wanting to go to companies, not just as suddenly embracing it, but ones that actually have already been doing it and have been doing it for a long time. So I think what you're going to see is, really this war, power struggle between employers and employees, because I think employers and leaders in particular see the value of the office and being together in one place as a higher priority than actually employees do. And actually having a fully remote company does bring to the floor for certain challenges. I don't think at the moment we have a particularly good system of remote working, flexible working, because quite often you'll see people going to the office these days and they're sitting in offices with headphones on, speaking to people who are working remotely from home. So, it's not really, those going to the office are not really getting that social engagement, social capital, connection, creativity and spark that perhaps they once did. So I think the future of remote flexible working actually is not this kind of one policy fits all, is actually about creating flexibility and autonomy and responsibility within small teams. And actually the leaders within those small teams, creating a culture where it's about responsibility to others rather than just the autonomy of the self. Because I think it's really important that we recognize that flexibility goes both ways. And if we are to inculcate a culture of flexibility for the future, where people have greater control over their time and where they work, it is also about recognizing what obligations they have to their teams and also what obligations they have to their company, as to basically that's how you create a loyalty and that's how you create that sense of belonging, which I really fear is going to be lost if people aren't turning up to the office and fully working remote.
Very interesting. So, Julia, that goes to more or less the crux of what you've been doing over the course of the last 10 years. I don't want to talk just about your business, but it is very interesting to compare notes, because obviously you have somehow or other managed to turn it into the idea that, well, where companies all have away days to go and bond with each other, you presumably have in days somewhere in order to manage to get to know each other better. But how do you manage to do that? How do you get people to be loyal to the company?
Well, I think the first thing is to think about two really key elements. One of them is about autonomy and hiring well and hiring people who really understand that with the freedom and flexibility comes also accountability and professionalism. So therefore, you can have a very flexible working life, but be under no illusion that the quality of the work must remain high. And there's no compromise about that, by the way. There's no compromise on that whatsoever. And so actually that gets embedded very, very quickly in terms of how people hand work to each other, their accountability, not only for themselves. And I love Eliza's comments there about yourself, your team, your organization. But then also the other part is the leadership. And the leadership that understands that the power of strong communication, two-way communication, and expectation setting, which are terms that every leader will have in their playbook. But those two things are probably the most important in terms of accounting for workflow management, individual coaching, team performance, and also bringing together people who actually have a sense of duty towards each other, because they understand that if one piece of the wheel doesn't work, and particularly if we're working in a flexible model, you have to absolutely be accountable for the delivery of high quality work at the time you say you're going to deliver, if not earlier. And there's one other thing, which is actually the ability to raise flags early. Red flags early is something we pay a lot of time and heed to, because then things can get sorted out further down the line. It's the last minute panic when somebody turns in work very late at night. It's got to be picked up the next morning, and actually there are some issues around it. Those are kind of really key to the communication and leadership.
Very interesting. And let me just say on an aside, thank you very much, Bob. Paul, good evening, good afternoon, Bob. It's lovely to see you watching us today. Greetings. And he's saying good evening to Patrick, Julia, and Eliza. It's fascinating, isn't it, Julia, when you're talking about that, you say the responsibility to your colleagues, etc. Do you find that as a result of remote working, that your staff actually end up working longer? Because I've heard this is like an issue. A lot of people have said, oh, we end up working much, much longer because we're sitting at home.
Well, we do pay a lot of attention to how do you switch off, actually. It's very, if you were to join my organization on day one, you and I would have a call, the very, very first call on your first day, where I will talk about the importance of switching off as much as being accountable and communicating well, for that very reason, because otherwise we become completely absorbed and it never stops. So actually, from my point of view, I don't really mind when people work. There is some bulk of work that has to be done during the working day, and there's usually a kind of 8 till 6, 8 till 7 kind of margin around that, because we have clients in Singapore and San Francisco. So you've got to have a degree of flexibility around that. But other people happily will turn in research work. We've got one member of the team who will turn in work at 2 o'clock in the morning, which worries me deeply. But then her pushback was, it is the perfect time for me to work, partly because she's from Brazil. So she's very much a night owl. And the second thing is she has a young family. And she said, that's the time when I can do great work at that time of the night, uninterrupted. And I'm very happy to be turning it in at that time. So I have to become comfortable with that, because it was worrying me. But it is important that people set parameters of when they're available, when they're not available, but with a degree of flexibility. Occasional exceptions as well really matter.
So that brings me, Eliza, carry on.
I was just going to say, I think there's a real challenge for the financial services industry, and particularly big companies, because just trying to control that, that very example that Julia's just cited there about, knowing the uniqueness of that Brazilian lady's circumstance and understanding that that's when she's most likely to produce the best work. It's just very difficult to replicate that intimacy at a bigger corporation. And I think within bigger organizations, particularly financial services, there's almost a kind of leaning towards blanket policies on flexible working, which are inherently, by that very definition, inflexible. And actually, I think if you're talking about the generation coming through the workforce now, your new recruits, your Gen Zers, so those in their early 20s, they're so used, whether it's through their phone or through education or even through the parenting they've experienced, a level of personalization and individualism and understanding of their circumstance, that therefore when they go into the workplace, they are just going to expect that slightly tailored package. Now, obviously, belonging to a big organization requires you to adapt and amend and understand that. But I do think that engaging people and their specific circumstances is the future of work, because as we've seen, technology enables work to enter the home. So I think actually we need to equal that out by saying the home much more, and people's domestic circumstances need to enter and be understood in the workplace. And just one final thing, I did work for a company not long ago who had 70% of their recruits hired during the pandemic. And their major challenge was to create a sense of unity, collaboration, responsibility, and sense of belonging. And a lot of them were incredibly young as well, and had a really productive pandemic, but a one in which many of them were not working from home, they were working from bed. They were working in a shared household with no desks and very little facilities. And so it was about actually almost teaching them what work, how it should be done, what work-life balance was, because they were just starting from that experience of the pandemic. And I think actually a lot of companies are having to actually retrain their employees as to what work-life balance means in the flexible age.
Very interesting. So you have that case of work-life balance. Okay, you have to address that. I'm actually interested. There was one thing you said, which is you went straight through and you said the Great Resignation, it's a thing. Now, I don't disagree with you. It has been a huge thing, I think, across Main Street. But isn't it interesting that actually
Oh dear.
I was going to say, I think Patrick's...
We're having difficulties connecting with you at the moment, and I'm going to move to the emergency something. Has the light got the power gone or something? I think we've just had a slight problem.
Well, I wonder if I could pick up on a remark that Eliza was making earlier, just while you're sorting out your Wi-Fi, Patrick. So it's really interesting because I think that those organisations that need to bring in that young talent and frame it around needing to understand some working principles, but also will recognise that those individuals need to maintain their productivity because they have been hyper-productive during the lockdown, but also they need to be able to prioritise to build in other efficiencies. And I think this is where some of the tension is lying at the moment, actually. When people go, when I was left alone in my bedroom, much as I may not have been happy, I was hyper-productive. Now you want me to come to meetings. You need me to commute. You need me to plan to be in a certain place 20 minutes ahead to get through security. All of those sort of things. Well, actually, I don't feel like I've done a great deal today because all I've done is travel between meetings. I use that as an example. And I think this is going to be the fascinating blend of how do we bring best practice into both and also protect people throughout all of that.
I couldn't agree more with that. In a way, people have realised how much time they wasted, but also how much time they've got back. And, for example, my husband's worked from home pretty much the last year and a half. And he said, I'm not having water cooler moments with my colleagues. I'm having water cooler moments with my kids. And, we have a 4-year-old and an 18-month-old, and that's invaluable. My son grew up the first 3 years of his life and really didn't see that much of his father, certainly in the evenings, really only on weekends. And my daughter, who was born during the pandemic, has seen her father every day. And that time is invaluable. And I think people are going to want to protect that and not give it back willy-nilly. Without due consideration.
Yeah, and I have a few other considerations which we really have to be very mindful of. One of them is, as leaders, when you're bringing people back into a hybrid working environment, that it's really important to recognise who's in the room and who's not in the room, and make sure that everybody in the room or out of the room is treated equally. So we're hearing stories about actually the number of women leaving the workplace is increasing quite considerably, and also that those from an ethnic minority representation and background are also being disadvantaged. Now, for some reasons, they may well not be able to be in the office because of being at risk, actually, of catching COVID. That has changed a little as vaccinations have increased, but there's certainly some areas of society that are not happy to be vaccinated, and therefore in the organisation, people have very strong opinions about whether you should be vaccinated and in the office. But actually, just in terms of just recognizing who's in the room and who's not in the room, and not disadvantaging those who actually are probably incredibly talented, hyper-productive, exceptionally good at what they do, but just not necessarily under our noses at any given moment when key decisions are made. And I am concerned that actually a lot of this is putting back some of the great work around the female workforce, and also some of the the ethnic minority representation in our workplaces.
You're so right. And actually, if you look at all the data, the demographic that most wants to work from home are working mothers. And that's the demographic that is most disadvantaged at that point in their career. And you do worry that a culture of presenteeism will prevail. And those, not just that are in the meetings when the big decisions are made, but are able to go to the pub afterwards, or catch a sandwich with their boss or their mentor, and just have those kind of casual interactions that are so important in building rapport or building understanding of what each other does or their contribution. And that inevitably leads in 5 years' time to a diversity crisis that we've spent 20 years trying to alleviate and improve, where the ones that are getting the promotion are the ones that are in the office, and invariably those are the young white males.
And I wonder if I could just return to the point about why all this matters, by the way, because naturally some people watching might just go, well, that's just life, isn't it? That's, it's socially important we have diversity and inclusion, but actually does it really matter? And the reality is that when we think about the organizations that are going to succeed and really thrive through this kind of return to work hopefully coming out of pandemic reality, is that the ones who appreciate that the diversity inclusion makes a considerable commercial return. Right. Performance is better when you have diversity at the table, and performance is better not only in terms of the products and services you create, because you must have diverse brains around creating products and services, but also in extending and unlocking access to capital, access to investment, access to consumers. So those organizations who get this right now will shoot ahead. We're already seeing it, actually. Those enlightened leaders who get this joke are off. If I look at the world of fintech, there are some organizations who are completely all over this. And there are other organizations who are insisting upon some of these more traditional practices, and who are disadvantaging some people not in the room. And also thinking about, how do they manage their teams, who actually are already getting behind the curve. And this is about acceleration. Everybody's on their diversity inclusion journey. The question is, how far behind are you falling as we go through this pivotal moment right now?
Exactly. And also about attracting the right young talent as well, and the best young talent. Not only are they have grown up in a diverse and inclusive world, that they want that reflected in their workplace, but also they are prioritizing flexible working arrangements, and if they don't see it or have to fight for it, they're not going to apply to your organization.
Yeah. And one thing I'm really excited by, and I can't use the word age while we bring Patrick back on, but the age is really important. So we've talked naturally and understandably with a mind to young talent. But, we have 5 generations working in financial services today. And I think there's a really interesting bit, which doesn't get talked about nearly enough, which is how do we get those 5 generations to blend, learn from each other? We don't have enough people who understand business principles and leadership principles, etc., and the experience of having lived through many financial crises, but also in terms of retraining and reskilling as well. But sorry, Patrick, forgive me. We've got a little bit carried away, actually.
This is wonderful. No, this is absolutely terrific. I really appreciate it. We got a message while I was offline. I'm sorry. We have Gale Force winds this evening in Valletta, and they obviously took the internet out. It's great to see #women on it hacking the future was the message we were given just while I was off air. And I think that's absolutely fair. Well done, ladies. You rock. Thank you for carrying the conversation. Eliza.
Well, I was just going to say what Julia said was so important about perhaps people sitting at home going, oh, I'm already bored of the debate about flexible working. And I have some sympathy with that, because I'm very much at the coalface of talking to organisations and getting a sense of how they are dealing with this and what they perceive the future to be. But I think we cannot underestimate, I do really believe this as a historian, I am used to thinking in centuries, not decades, okay, that this is the most important shift in the history of work since the Second World War. And it is going to lead to, sadly, a greater divide within the workforce between those that can work remotely and flexibly and those that can't. We saw that pronounced in the pandemic, and that will continue, I think. I think it will lead to an acceleration of AI and robotics within the workplace and automation more generally. I think it will lead to the true internationalization of the workforce, because hey, if everyone's remote, why not pay someone half the price of that lives halfway across the world to do the job? I think it will lead to, as I say, real questions around rights for workers and the autonomy of workers, because how do we legislate and protect those working at home, just from a kind of physical health and safety perspective, never mind anything else, discrimination perspective, for example. So I do think this is the most important discussion to emerge out of the pandemic. I think you're seeing, as Julia brilliantly reflected upon, a lot of older people just going, don't want anything to do with this. This is a disruption that I don't want to have to kind of be involved in the next 5 years. And actually the greatest kind of resignation we have seen has been actually in the over 65s. And it's true, in the last 10 years, we've seen growing numbers of those working older, sometimes out of want, sometimes out of need. But actually a lot of baby boomers actually retired during the pandemic. So I think, Julia, this is what I spend most of my day doing, talking about and helping companies with, is trying to blend the generations and talk about the challenges, the very real challenges and difficulties of that multi-generational workforce, and trying to bridge that gap. I could talk to you for an hour, hours, literally hours, but I won't. But yes, that's absolutely what I do, because actually it's the last acceptable discrimination in the workplace, which is ageism, and it goes both ways. And I see it on, those microaggressions across the board, and it's something that is seen as socially acceptable, but actually incredibly corrosive for workplace culture.
So, I mean, I think that's a brilliant point. Apart from anything else, you're now my mother's new heroine, because she feels quite badly done by ageism as she tries to book a tennis court every week for one of her 3 weekly games. But it's a great point. And in fact, actually, I think, Julia, if anything, you were quite feasibly being conservative on financial markets, because I was reading today about that active fund manager, Charlie Munger, the sidekick to Warren Buffett, still working full-time at Berkshire Hathaway at the sprightly age of 98 years old. I mean, he's older than our Queen, God bless her. I mean, Gong Xi Fa Chai, everybody, Happy New Chinese Year. But I mean, on Sunday, 70 years on the throne of Great Britain. Isn't that quite incredible? I mean, quite the achievement altogether. Although admittedly, I mean, it could be, of course, she was a leader in the field because she's been working from home for quite a large amount of her career. Perhaps that's the advantage.
Can I just say something? I work for the royal household, and they have a multi-generational workforce that spans from 18 to 97. So I think that's 6 generations. I never did the calculation.
Yeah.
But it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary.
Yes, and actually that's shortened because the Queen Mother passed away. Previously, they had up to about 103 amongst the entourage, I think, at that stage. It's absolutely fantastic. It's really, really good. A marvelous session we're hearing from LinkedIn. Listening at this end, one middle-aged man and his 14-year-old daughter. Bookends. Well, it's a funny name for a daughter, but bookends. I'm glad to hear that you're watching this evening. Sorry, that was a terrible joke. That was terrible. Very, very low-hanging fruit. That's bad. It's great. It's absolutely fantastic. Take one word of advice from me, if you would, young lady. You know, the old bloke, the grey-haired. You rock the future. You listen to your dad and you go out and do it, just like these ladies are doing. Wednesday night, PhD. There's actually a live stream for you, presented by my brilliant wife. You can catch it on LinkedIn and YouTube as well. So, absolutely fantastic. We've got multiple generations here watching us this evening. That's absolutely fabulous altogether. But it is interesting, actually. Oh, that's Mark Wheatley who was addressing us this evening from LinkedIn. Hello, Mark. It's lovely to hear from you again. Lovely to hear from your daughter too. Now, how do we manage to cope with this ageism thing in an era of hybrid working, progressive working, and the possibility? I mean, who's actually? I don't want to start a race to the bottom here, but who are more invisible? Are we finding that, for example, women who work from home are more invisible, or older people, or how do we solve these issues? Eliza.
So who's more invisible? I think it sounds like a game show. I think in the workplace, I do think, particularly because of the infiltration of technology in the last 10 years, there's an emphasis on young talent, because you've got a generation coming into the workforce who the technology in the palm of their hand is more sophisticated quite often than technology they're using in the workplace. And those technical skills aren't something they learn in the workplace, but quite often come to the workplace with. That wasn't always historically the case. Quite often you went to work to be trained rather than turn up with those skills. However, I think older people are being discriminated against, and I would say particularly older women. And I think it's fantastic and very encouraging that you've seen over the last sort of decade and a half, more and more older workers continuing to stay in the workplace. But I don't think they're being used effectively, and they're certainly not being educated and upskilled in the way that they should be. I think there's a tendency within organizations to kind of do the training at the beginning and maybe at the middle if you're, kind of standout leader, but kind of just by 40 expected to kind of get on with it and know what you're doing. And I think we're talking about moving into an era where, because of automation, because of people working longer, we need to be talking about lifelong learning in the workplace and constantly having that opportunity to be reskilling in order to compete with machines, obviously, but also just to keep people fresh. I mean, I love what Julia was saying about needing that experience and that memory within your organization. And I remember working with a tech company that they realized that the average age in the tech company was 28. So they actively went out to employ people in their 40s that could remember the first .com bust. And they wanted to diversify the age within the organization, because they recognized that whilst they needed the kind of entrepreneurial ingenuity of youth, they needed that experience and that understanding of what had gone before of those older workers.
And my life's in fintech. So I take, for example, today I've been mentoring with probably about 24 fintech startup companies. And what's fascinating is, first of all, fintech entrepreneurs don't tend to be in their 20s. They actually tend to be in about their 30s and 40s, because they've worked in the financial services in some, whether it's payments or whether it's a capital markets or treasury or custody or whatever that's going to be. And they realize that there are working models upon which financial services technology can be applied to make it more efficient. So what is fascinating there is you're seeing these entrepreneurs come through who are young, entrepreneurially minded, energetic side of 40, say early 40s, but who recognize you need the domain experience. You need to have people who have been kicking around these particular aspects of financial services, this weird and wonderful world we inhabit, in order to understand how post-trade clearing works, to understand, how transaction management works, asset allocations. I could just keep going on margining. I mean, just imagine. And we do need to have that experience in the industry that is then having to align with the middle tier, the kind of early 40s, late 30s, early 40s, who are going, I'm going to go and build this business and drive this business, that is also combining with the young digital talent that is going to basically empower the business. And what's fascinating there is why not get that model to just twist a little and get technical digital domain experts developed within your organization, and also get domain experts who become inherently digital by learning from the other sides of the organization. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, I call it the bold generation, actually, which I'm a member of. It's the born analog, live digital, which I discussed in my book, Victory or Death, because there's something to that. I mean, we didn't have computers until we were essentially into double figures. And it's quite fascinating to see how that changed. I think also it has to be said that a huge amount of our audience have suddenly got really excited. You said words like margin and collateral and retail. And they all whoa, yeah, that's our language. Somebody speaking to us at last year. The first time we with half an hour of all this interesting newfangled stuff like women and diversity and all of those sorts of things and ageism. And now suddenly, we've got Robert Brown. So Julia, connect with us. LinkedIn, thank you. Great to hear from you, Robert. Great to hear from Charlie Asks as well. Thank you very much for all your comments. Thank you, Mazavashkevich, for checking in. And it's really, really interesting, isn't it? How you need that experience in order to really maximize what's going on. Right. And also... No, go ahead.
I just want to jump in with one very, very quick thing, which is, and that's where low code is really empowering, because you've got leaders with great domain expertise who don't necessarily need to know how the technology is built, but can apply frameworks in order to drive digital transformation. And that's one area that I would pay a lot of attention to. Really, really exciting around that.
It's super exciting, isn't it? I mean, the whole low code, no code marketplace is incredible, because essentially, as long as you can use a keyboard and think.
I'm lost. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, that's the problem when you're dealing with old people like us. We've ended up having to stop coding properly and use low code, no code to make up for the age difference.
It sounds like a dance.
Well, actually, I can quickly explain. So it's the idea is that you're building tech. Think of it like Lego bricks. So rather than having to build a platform, enterprise platform that is empowering your trading, for example, you don't have to go back to the coding and the programming. You actually essentially take a building like a Lego block that is already built. So that's on low code, or better still, there is no code required. And then you put the blocks together, and then you could add your functionality and your own requirements over the top. So you can build faster with confidence, but also the data all flows between them. And I won't even get into APIs, Eliza. That's another conversation for another day. You look forward to that one.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we haven't even hit the watershed threshold, I'm sure, in many jurisdictions where we're being watched before you can start showing us your APIs at this stage, Julia. Well, we're talking with two diverse tech musketeers at this juncture, and a quite interesting discussion as we launch into low code, no code. Actually, there was a very good discussion on low code, no code amongst many of the guests on PhD, my wife's show on a Wednesday. So you can catch that if you go Google Woman on It on YouTube. You'll certainly be able to find it quite easily, where she was talking to Fibery, which is a fabulous low-code, no-code work environment. Just one of many things. It's so powerful. And it is great because anybody, if you can use Lego bricks, if you can use a keyboard, you can drag and drop your way to absolutely awesome amounts of processing power, which was not available to those of us who started, born analog, and the first time we saw digital, it was a Sinclair ZX81 or something. It's quite incredible. So that's quite amazing. And in fact, we have a comment precisely on that. Yes, you need to watch the Woman on It low code, no code live stream with the fabulous Paulina from Fibery. I do believe my wife is watching this show, ladies and gentlemen. Gosh, that's very good news. So as we work our way through this excellent day of Chinese New Year, Eliza, what?
Well, I was just going to comment on something you said about being born analog but live digital. And I think that's great to appreciate that. And I think that you are able, I'd call you a bridger, because you're effectively, hopefully, therefore capable of managing the analogs in your business and the digital natives in your business. And actually, I think when we're talking about just to get back to the ageism point, a fundamental challenge of leadership, which is about empathy. Can you understand and empathize and comprehend someone that has lived in a different time? Because I know that essentially there is a truth to all of this, which is we are all a product of our time. We may not fit within those nice, cozy, general generational kind of synopses that you see on those infographics, but ultimately we are all a product of our time. I was first I first joined Facebook in 2015, which is really, really late. I look at my sister, just 5-6 years younger, and her use of social media, her knowledge of social media is just so much more inherent and central actually to also who she is. So I think that it's just understanding we are all a product of our time is really important and actually really hard, because understanding what events, how they shape them, even this pandemic, it was an age discriminate disease that affected the different generations very differently. And how can you as a leader really empathize and understand and bridge that gap of time and not make assumptions, but understand as individuals, we are all a product of our time. And that's a real challenge and requires a lot of empathy and a lot of externalization.
Julia?
Nothing to add really, but I think that's absolutely right, which is just understanding where people come from. And I think Eliza used the real watchword, which is belonging. And if you want to belong in an organization needs to understand what shapes you, past, present, and also what is going to shape your future, and therefore the role that they play in it. But also, how do we all turn up, and how do we belong and hang together?
I mean, do you think, Julia, that financial services in particular have got a real problem with belonging, particularly with young people, particularly post-pandemic?
Well, I think it's got a massive problem, full stop, actually. I think that its ability to connect with young people as a career path is diminishing significantly. You think about some of that digital talents we were talking about, actually, do I want to go? Okay, so you may not want to go and work for a Facebook. You may have an opinion on Amazon. You may feel very strongly you want to be at Google, but take that in the world of technology a million times over, and your options are ever increasing to go and work somewhere else. But also we have a huge problem actually with the digital talent pipeline, full stop. I found some horrific data about 7% of people in England between 18 and 65, only 7% are doing any sort of qualification in level 4 and level 5 technology. And that's the lowest in the OECD countries. So we have a massive pipeline problem. I think we have a problem today with people going, I want to work in banking, finance, capital markets, and they're not necessarily connecting with seeing that as either a career path or indeed an organization where they will be accepted, appreciated, championed, and also have a career. They may come in to get the brand and then get out again. That's another kind of conversation. But also just in terms of our ability to retain that talent and to be able to innovate, I think it's a huge problem. Is
it also, I mean, I'm a geriatric millennial, okay? I fess up on that front. And I remember those graduate recruitment fairs when I was graduating from university around sort of 2002, and you go round and it would be the milk round, you get the free tote bag and the pen, and it was a real kudos, a real aspiration of my peers, never me, my peers, to work for the big banks, the big consultancy firms, and a real feeling that was a really exciting, to go to the city was a really exciting place to be and a measure of status and success. That has obviously been, in the last 10 years, supplanted by the tech industry. And when I think back to the 1980s, it was the oil and gas industry, which obviously now really has a recruitment problem with Gen Z. So, there's always been sexy industries which has attracted the best talent. And I think that financial services had its day. And I think that the financial crisis was the moment when that came to an end. I've also worked with organizations where they've tried to create that kind of tech startup feel by, almost creating the aesthetic of a tech startup with the ping pong and the breakfast bar and all of that. And almost like it's in a separate building to the main bank. So there's a different dress code, there's a different set of people, it's like completely different organization. And I do worry about that, because do those young, they're quite often young by the way, people working in that tech startup within a bank actually feel connected to the bank? And how long do they actually stay? I mean, it just strikes me as what realistically can be done within the financial services industry to help.
I also have a terrible feeling when I see that approach to fintech. I mean, having written the first best-selling book of fintech in 1999, at which point in time so many people in the world were utterly analog, particularly the banks, and they were trying to ignore it and hope it went away. When I see those setups, Eliza, they always remind me of actually kindergarten I mean, you have the school, and then you go around the corner, and then there's all this glorious color and slides and all sorts of exciting things to do. And that's for the 3 and 4 year olds. And they're never allowed out. They don't even get break time at the same time as the primary school children in case they interact with each other. And I agree. I mean, I think the best thing you could ever see would be actually a few pleasantly, elegantly suited bankers in there playing ping pong and finding out what goes on, because they're actually trying to. I'm afraid I'm very cynical. I mean, I think a lot of the time they're adopting this sort of youthist sort of ethos, and they all just look as horrible as politicians wearing baseball caps. I mean, it's an ugly image most of the time.
Mm. Well, I think that's right. And I think, this has to be authentic. It has to be absolutely lived and breathed right the way through the organization. It's sometimes hard to do. If you are in a particular business domain, in an organization where it's perhaps the drier end, but yet in terms of banking infrastructure is incredibly important end, then sometimes innovation doesn't necessarily cross your desk on a daily basis. However, what's interesting now is that everybody's looking at every single element of a bank, a financial institution, an infrastructure player, wherever you sit into the worldwide ecosystem. I hate that word. But actually, the point being that everybody is looking at anything that's excessively manual has potential to be addressed and to be innovated, and that the platforms and data and APIs and low codes and all the stuff we've talked about does have a role to play, which is where that is your potential to drive innovation and digital appreciation authentically right the way through your organization, rather than have it on the periphery. And I think if you look at, so we've been going sort of 15 years, fintech is what we do all day, from early stage startups right the way to some of the world's largest financial institutions around the world. And those organizations that used to send a head of innovation, who was the one allowed to wear jeans, off to all these exciting showcase days, wasn't necessarily the person who was going to have the greatest impact. The most innovative people weren't necessarily, or the heads of innovation weren't necessarily the most innovative people. They were just people nobody else quite knew what to do with, if I'm honest. But they look great in jeans, and it looked great for the bank. But then did they bring that back? Did they really bring that back into the organization? So some of them, not all, now are going, no, we need to bring this in at every single level. We need to find ways of getting our employees and our staff to get involved with the innovation, either prescribing what's needed, giving input into a pathway ahead, or even just getting comfortable with low code and no code, and actually being embedded in the team that is going to drive that. So you sit shoulder by shoulder with people who go, we understand the tech, you understand the domain. Let's cooperate and let's work together on it. And by the way, let's try and break it. Let's try and get it wrong. And that's another really big thing, which is financial institutions are highly regulated. They're very risk averse, so they have to be. Their discomfort with failure. The answer. They've got to become very comfortable with failure. And that's where things like the FCA sandboxes, places where you go, there are labs, places to go and test and try out, with data and all that stuff that actually is going to protect both the organization, but particularly the consumer and the customer as well. I've thrown quite a lot into that response, but actually these are the dynamics which those organizations paying great heed will do really well. But if you're going to just think that football and ping pong tables are the answer, I'm afraid they're not.
No, nor necessarily just thinking that having a man, and why is it always a man with a beard in jeans who is the head of innovation at a bank? They're the least diverse group I can think of, actually.
I've tried to grow the beard, but it just didn't quite work. I did try.
But it's true. I mean, it's always hilarious. It's always a man. It's always a bloke in jeans with a beard, and he always says, "I'm the innovation officer," which I also thought in itself was a slightly curious thing. Did the banks get like a sort of a 12-pack of them and just divide them up one afternoon in the graduate milk round?
I was going to say that's a really important point, though, because I think there's a certain uniform. Whether it's a beard, jeans, or whether it's braces and a pinstripe suit, which are associated with certain professions and even certain roles within that profession, and that it speaks to the tribe, the work tribe you belong to. And I think actually my generation and the generation after us are having a very different conversation around work, and it's about being authentic and a sense of fulfillment around work, and that you are defining work rather than work defines you. Now, there was a very famous article written a couple of years ago about millennial burnout, and it was chiefly built around this idea that we're the generation that we're told, go to university, get a stable job, and you will be, this pathway into stable middle class professional life will be open to you. Now, that promise has obviously been found wanton for all sorts of reasons. Stagnation of wages, rising house prices, rising childcare prices, all of that. And in many ways, we are disadvantaged in a way that our parents never were. But the knock-on effect of all of that is because that promise failed, our conversation around work and how it defines us and how it is such a large part of our day is fundamentally changing. And that conversation has been intensified, of course, by the pandemic. And I think you're seeing it on, obviously, the anti-work movement on Reddit. We are and have been since the 1980s in a work environment where all of the security and a lot of the perks and privileges of a professional job have been eroded. And the expectations of the worker have been increased, particularly through technology. And I think we're starting to actually question that in a really big and important way. And that's about being ourselves at work, but it's also about the kind of work people want to do, how they want to do it, and how much time and how much money they want to be paid for it.
Now, Eliza, I want to ask you one question, actually, because it's something that flows from, I know Cindy Gallop talks about this a lot of the time, where she says, well, bear in mind the fact that in America, I think for the last 10 years, 50% of the decision makers for buying new cars are actually women. And you raised a great conversation we were talking about the other day, because we've talked about ageism, we've talked about diversity, and yet the reality is power, financial power, is moving into the hands of diverse groups and particularly women, is it not?
Yes, I mean, I think we hear a lot about these days the great wealth transfer, that transfer of wealth from chiefly baby boomers to millennials. But actually, before it goes to the kids, it goes to the wife. Quite often the wife, because they are outliving their husbands, and it's the part of life's journey where women absolutely are the benefactor. So by 2025 in the UK, 60% of the nation's wealth will be in female hands. So you've got a cohort of women who will be the real power brokers in society. Now, I've just finished a big project with Schroders. The report came out this week, interviewing these women, trying to decide what and how they're thinking about money and this inheritance and what they want to do with it, and how they want the financial services industry to engage with them and help them, and of course educate them as well, because a lot of these women in their 70s, I think, were the generation that perhaps gave up work and certainly surrendered the big financial decisions to their husbands. So a lot of them felt really insecure around money, investments, and were starting and desiring in their later years to take charge of that money, and really, I think, wanted better education on how to invest it and how to spend it. And I also think we're talking about the next generation of women in their 50s, who had perhaps more of them went to university, they're better educated, they're not as rich as the baby boomers, but they have made their own money. And actually, women in their 50s are the biggest spenders, much more than men, on luxury purchases. 80% of luxury travel purchases in the US are made by women in their 50s. They are the big spenders, the credit card generation, but also they are, I think, have had that crucial period in their lives before perhaps they got married and had kids, where they were financially independent. And they're the first generation of women, by the way, to do that. So I think you're going to see in the next 10 years real transformations around who owns the money, who's making the big financial decisions, and crucially, in an inheritance economy, who's inheriting the money. And it's primarily women.
Yeah, and you're talking about, what was it, 65% of wealth is going to be in the hands of women in the course of the next 10 years, according to that Schroders report. Absolutely fascinating. Now, ladies, we're running short on time, so therefore it's the time to ask you the big question. Where do you see the revolution, whether that's the capital market revolution or something else entirely revolutionary, going next? Let me start with Eliza.
Gosh, I actually am really worried about the role of social media and influencers on investments and financial advice when it comes to young people. And so I really want good, verified education and information out there for young people when it comes to investments.
Wow. Very profound stuff. Julia, are you going to tell us that you've just started your TikTok channel, or where do you see the revolution going next?
Well, actually, do you know, I was spending quite a lot of time, not masses of time, but more than I imagined I would, looking at the metaverse. And I think about, we've talked about demographics. We've talked about a generation that is going to be empowered financially, but also that isn't being able to spend the way that we have spent in the history, in terms of recent history, and is looking at ways to own investments in universes where actually nothing is physical. And if I look at the role of non-fungible tokens, NFTs, look at digital assets, look at cryptocurrencies, look at metaverses where people have got basic avatars and people are now spending to dress avatars, people are investing in property in virtual communities, that actually that's where I think capital markets will take us potentially in the future.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, really fascinating. And of course, bear in mind the fact that in Second Life, within 6 months of it starting up, it had, I think, no fewer than 23 different stock exchanges, which was quite an exciting round of mergers and acquisitions subsequently took place in the early metaverse. Yes.
Look at Crypto Island. Now, whether you believe it,
yes.
It's good or bad, it's just very, very interesting. So I think actually, and John has just put the point in there about young people do need education investments. I completely agree with that.
Absolutely.
Can I just add something? One of the things that I think is going to be a growth industry is death, and particularly the monetizing the data of the dead. Because, I mean, you've already got a demographic. This is quite a macabre statement here, but, you know, we've got the fastest growing demographic is on Facebook. It's baby boomers on Facebook. And it's estimated by 2050, the profiles of the dead will outnumber the living on Facebook. So what happens to all that data? Is it monetized? And as we know, we've got an aging society, an aging society that is on social media documenting their lives. And obviously more and more people younger down the generational chain documenting their lives. So what happens to that data when people die? Who's in control of it, and can it be monetized? I think Zuckerberg is about to become a CEO of a mass graveyard, and it just so happens that meta means death in Hebrew. So there's a kind of synergy and sense to it.
Well, that's a very profound piece of translation for us on this Chinese New Year's Day. I hadn't thought we were going to get some Hebrew thrown into the mix. Thank you very much, Eliza. Actually, I will offer you an instant counter, which is a previous guest on this show, Colin Howard, who is, in my opinion, the finest technological mind and a septuagenarian that you are ever going to see, is actually running something, My Digital Life, which is precisely based around taking control of all of your data through your lifetime in order to manage to effectively deal with this issue and problem. And certainly you're absolutely right, because I know more than a few people on my LinkedIn connections who are sadly no longer with us. And actually, you look at the amount of data people are going to consume. We'll get a shameless book plug here for Victory or Death. I mean, you look at how much data a person used in their lifetime, and essentially the whole world was using less data up until basically about 1800, the entirety of history from ancient Egypt, use less data than the financial markets use today. In a day, they are now generating so much stuff. So you think about that in relation to financial markets, you think about that in relation to the mega data that's out there. It's quite incredible. We had a slide appeared earlier, ladies and gentlemen, because we're going to be going this week from our fabulous power ladies, Julia Streets and Dr. Eliza Filby, to Dr. Arya Redsen. She's going to be talking about From First North to Infinity and Beyond. Next week, on behalf of NASDAQ, we're going to be looking at small cap stocks and all of those sorts of things. Another fabulous power woman for our cadre of guests that have been on the IPO-VID live show. It only remains for me to say, well, a huge thank you to our very, very engaging guests, Julia Street and Dr. Eliza Filby. Thank you also for actually presenting the show for a few minutes when the multiple storms got the better of us during the course of the evening. You're an absolute pro, Julia, as always. Thank you so much. I actually have to say, well, the comment that really gripped me, I loved it, Eliza, when you said just earlier on about the 10-minute mark, anybody who tells us they know the answer to the ultimate question of working from home is lying. I think everybody at that point in time was probably standing on the back of the sofa cheering as they were sitting at home, because it's such a complex issue to look at. You've talked as well, recognize who's in the room, Julia Streets, and I think that's very important, whether you're looking up, you're looking down, remembering who's actually in the room and who's not in the room. And therefore, of course, you emphasize at the first point how important it is. Diversity is better in teams, as indeed, amongst other people, the fabulous, the incredible Cindy Gallop will often remind us. I want to say thank you very much to everybody who's contributed this evening. Thank you very, very much, Robert Brown. I absolutely loved with your various comments during the course of this evening. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed that change of gear. Thank you, Ian Miller, who was telling us it was a great conversation tonight, which you very much enjoyed. Absolutely delighted to think of that image for this evening of Mark Wheatley and his daughter on the couch. You rock, girl. We hope to see you at PhD tomorrow evening. Thank you, Les Calvert, Simon Huckle, Marcus Ward, Bob Paul, Max Vashkovich, Rob Brown once again. Thank you, Batty Young. Thank you, Ian Miller. Thank you, John T. Thank you, Bob, for those kind words. Brilliant panel, thought-provoking. But actually, I want to finish this off with a comment that came close to home. Thank you very much, Mrs. Young. My highlight on a Tuesday evening is watching IPO-VID. Patrick Young, fabulous guest. I feel robbed of great speakers for #woman on it. Thank you for the great discussion, Julia Streets and Dr. Eliza Filby. This conversation, I predict, this is what we call masculine intuition, is going to continue, but in a future episode of PhD with the brilliant Dr. Eliza Filby and Julia Streets. I do hope we'll see you there. Thank you for being part of IPO-VID number 53. It only remains for me, Patrick L. Young, to wish you a great week in life and markets on behalf of our guests this evening. Thank you to all the audience. And of course, I wish you all a great week reading Exchange Invest, a great week with Valerium PLC, and indeed a great week in life and markets. Thanks for watching.